Hi, everyone. My name's Justin. I'm happy to be here. I'm a philosopher by training, interested in epistemology and things like beliefs and knowledge and reasons. And a number of years ago, in fact, shortly after the Trump election, I became really interested in applied epistemic issues that have to do with fake news. So I worked on a project that resulted in a book called Beyond Fake News. And the goal for today is to try to give you a kind of theoretical construct for understanding the kind of fake news epidemic that we find ourselves in, and a kind of way into understanding the many different pieces of the fake news epidemic. So in terms of procedure, I'll run through a kind of brief presentation. I'll use the first half of the hour to do that. So if you have questions or concerns or issues you want to raise, take note of those as I'm going through the presentation, and I'd really like to talk to you about those towards the second half of the hour. So let's just get started and jump right into it. Why should we even care about fake news? Of course, there's lots of reasons to care about fake news. A bunch of them might be, personal reasons. Fake news might be bad for you personally, might be bad for your health or for your investments or whatever. But I think, at least for many of us, fake news is particularly problematic because we live in democracies. Anytime we live in a place where there's shared decision-making, the spread of fake news, I think, is particularly problematic. The basic idea was stated by Francis Bacon: knowledge is power. If you strip away the knowledge, you're stripping away the power. And take a look at this chart. This is a chart that the Pew Research Center put together, trying to chart the partisan divide in the United States in 1994. So this is the year I graduated from high school. This is sort of what America looked like in terms of its divide. Pew would ask people 20 questions, and if you answered all 20 in a consistently liberal way, you're at one side of that divide. If you answered all 20 in a consistently conservative way, you're at the other side. And you can see here, there's a pretty good spread of viewpoints, if you will, across the political right and left. And so there's a good amount in that kind of purple overlap. Well, take a look at what it looked like 20 years later. This is 2014, mind you, before Donald Trump was elected. You can see there's been a sort of cratering of the center when it comes to American polarization. People have been pulled either to that liberal pole or to the conservative pole, and the center has been hollowed out. I think fake news has driven much of this polarization. So I don't want to lay the blame for partisanship solely at the foot of fake news, but it's definitely part of it in the sense that it plays in a kind of positive feedback loop. People who find themselves on one side gravitate to certain news sources, those on the other gravitate to others, and over time they're being pulled apart. So how can we understand what's going on? What's the big idea here? How can we understand the fake news epidemic? And here's kind of the thesis of today's talk, the main idea. My claim is that if we think about information existing in a marketplace, then it makes it much easier to see why we face the kind of problem that we're faced with right now, where fake news is ever more prevalent and having ever more caustic effects on society. So that's the big idea. What I want to try to make clear for you over the course of the next 25 minutes or so is that when we think about information being like a toaster or a car or a book or anything else, then it becomes much easier to see how this fake news epidemic came about. And I hope it makes it easier to see what we might do about it. So that's kind of the big idea. So before we go any further, let me say something about what I mean by fake news, because people define this concept differently, depending on what their interests are. So I'm going to put content, if you will, into 4 different buckets. The first bucket is what you might think of as accurate information. So accurate information is going to be true propositional content that provides us with an accurate picture of the world. For example, in today's Washington Post, there was a report that there's a physician who's testifying in the George Floyd case. That's an instance of accurate information. But there's also deceptive information. Now, this is information in the sense that it's true propositional content, but in some ways it's misleading, or accepting this information distorts your worldview in an important way. Let me give you a kind of trivial example. Not long ago, I woke up and went downstairs to eat breakfast, and my kids had beaten me to the table. And I asked them if they left me any milk in the fridge. They said, yeah, there's milk in the fridge. Well, I go and I pull out a gallon of milk out of the fridge and pour it, and 2 or 3 drops of milk pour into my bowl. And I think, kids, what's up with this? And they said, well, we told you the truth. There was milk in there. Okay, fair enough. They spoke truly. They gave me information, but it was misleading in the sense that it set my expectations up for something that was ultimately inaccurate. And this happens all the time with fake news in the media. So an easy example is the election law in Georgia that's being hotly debated across, national media. Media on the left says that the law restricts voter access, restricts, in particular, certain demographics of voters from accessing the polls. Conservative sites say, no, in fact, the Georgia law expands access. Well, there's a sense in which both of those are true. Compared to earlier times, the Georgia law actually does expand certain kinds of voter access, in particular in rural counties. Compared to what happened last year during the COVID year, it's restricting access. So both sides are offering this kind of deceptive information that really should count as a kind of fake news. The last 2 categories are fairly straightforward. Misinformation is false content that's distributed unintentionally. Disinformation is false content that's distributed intentionally. For my purposes, the last 3 of these different kinds of content all count as fake news. We should care about believing truly about the world. It doesn't matter whether people are misleading us intentionally or unintentionally, if the result is the same, that we're misinformed. So by fake news, I just mean deceptive information, misinformation, disinformation. And there's an awful lot of it out there. I'm trying to figure out why. So here's the beginning of this kind of market explanation. Apologies to any of you who are professional economists. Here's a for dummies version of how markets work. Markets work within kind of 4 parameters. First, there are artificial constraints. Artificial constraints are constraints on what can be done by things like governments. So you might think about them as things that you shouldn't do, rather things that you can't do. For example, a child labor law is an example of a kind of artificial constraint on a market. There's lots of this in the news market. In fact, just on April 1st, the Supreme Court rolled back a regulatory limit on local media ownership. There used to be a kind of limit in place that prohibited corporations from saturating a local market within the media in a certain kind of way. Supreme Court just decided that that regulation is not constitutional. So that's an example of a kind of artificial constraint that went away. Second, markets work within natural constraints. There's only so much work a human body can produce. There are limits to shipping technology and so forth. Well, those same kind of natural constraints play out in the information market too. For example, printing technology or distribution of information technology. The last 2 have to do with supply and demand. The people who are producing a particular product have incentives, namely to make a profit, and consumers have particular incentives. They want to save money, they want to invest in socially conscious ways or whatever. So those are different features then that change the market. So with that in mind, why do we face a kind of fake news epidemic? Here are the 4 correlates to those kind of general principles about how markets work. It turns out that we face a kind of fake news epidemic, in part because of deregulation, in part because of electronic media, in part because of the incentives of news purveyors, and then in part because of the incentives of those of us who are consuming the news. All 4 of those play together then to explain why we face a kind of fake news epidemic. So I'm going to say something about each of these aspects. So point number 1, deregulation. In the 1940s, the FCC adopted a rule called the Fairness Doctrine. Roughly what it said was anyone using the kind of public airways, so radio stations, and then this later came to apply to TV stations, had to abide by certain kind of content constraints when it came to presenting controversial material. In particular, if these radio stations or news channels addressed controversial issues, they had to fairly address both sides of the issue. Ultimately, this doctrine was abandoned in the Reagan administration. There's a variety of reasons for that, the most important of which was the rise of cable news. Cable was not using the public airways, and so it was not subject to the Fairness Doctrine. So when CNN started in the early 80s, they could handle controversial topics in any way they saw fit, and they didn't have to compete then with ABC or NBC or CBS in that same kind of way. And since this doctrine only applied to some forms of media, not all, that was kind of ultimately the downfall for that particular regulatory doctrine. And in fact, with the demise of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, Rush Limbaugh rises to the radio stage in the very next year. And all of a sudden, this restriction that we not address things equally leads to a proliferation of kind of one-sided media sources, in particular on the political right. Point number two, not only does deregulation play some role in why we're facing a kind of fake news epidemic, but electronic media, the technology that comes along with that, has really been the catalyst for this fake news flood that we find ourselves presented with now. And there's a lot of different facets behind how electronic media gives rise to this kind of epidemic. So just think of the first bullet point. Electronic media increases the total informational volume to which any of us are exposed on a given day. You watch shows on the TV, you listen to it on the radio, you have information coming in at your fingertips through a phone throughout the day. We now have 24-hour cable news channels, we have Google. Just the amount of information that we've been exposed to has increased thousandfold. And the fact of the matter is, just by increasing the volume alone, that makes it difficult for us to figure out what's true. Just think about going to a restaurant. If a restaurant menu had 10,000 things on the menu, it would be much harder for you to zero in on the things that you really like, as opposed to having 10 or 12 things on the menu. It's no different with electronic media. Second, electronic media curates or allows us to curate the information to which we're exposed. So this is really a kind of a double-faceted move here. First, electronic media allows for self-curation. If you're conservative, you can turn on Fox News. If you're liberal, you can turn on MSNBC. We're allowed to kind of maneuver ourselves through the informational environment and then selectively expose ourselves only to a particular portion of that. That was much harder to do before the advent of electronic media. But second, not only does electronic media give us the option to maneuver through the informational flood, but we often rely on technology itself to sort that flood for us. And internet search is a perfect example. There is so much information out there that we couldn't possibly sort through it in an efficient way to try to find what we want. So we rely on algorithms to do it for us. Well, the fact of the matter is, Google searches are tailored. If Daniel does a search from New York City on some particular news item, and I do a search on it from Colorado, it's overwhelmingly likely that we'll get very different results. Google looks at the pages that you visit, Google looks at your browsing history, Google looks at a whole bunch of information to try to anticipate what sites you're likely to click on, and it delivers those sorts of results. But notice then, that's a terrible way to sort through the information if what you want is the truth. Instead of giving you the truth, Google gives you clickable results. And if what you want isn't somehow magically aligned with what's true, then there's no reason to think that the kind of Google results that you're going to get are going to be perfectly aligned with what's true or what's accurate. Third, electronic media boosts the speed at which information can be created and at which information can be shared. In fact, electronic media makes it really easy to share information, whether it's accurate information, misleading information, disinformation, or whatever. In the old days, my grandmother used to cut newspaper stories out that she thought I'd be interested in. She would fold them up, put them in a card, mail them to me. A week later, I would get them. Well, now, at the push of a button, you can share a story with however many people follow you on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever. And this makes it really easy for us to do the wrong thing when it comes to information. So, for example, recently there was a really interesting and kind of controversial story that was posted on Upworthy. Well, it turns out the story got 2,000 comments and tens of thousands of shares before anyone realized that the link to the story was dead. There was actually no content there whatsoever but a headline, and people were reading the headline alone and sharing it with their peers on social media, and people were getting engaged and outraged and everything else, and there wasn't even any content there. In fact, there was a recent study showing that nearly 70% of Facebook shares and comments were attached to stories that were unread. In other words, the stories themselves were never clicked to open, and that didn't stop us from sharing or liking them or whatever. Lastly, electronic media allows for the easy creation of fakes. It's so easy to fake information nowadays. All you need is a laptop and an internet connection. So it's obvious that things like this can be done at the click of a mouse with Photoshop. Here's an example from the last election cycle. Elizabeth Warren wasn't polling too well with Black voters. That didn't stop one of her someone in her campaign from just photoshopping a sign. They happened to take it from the Black Lives Matter protest and just, move in a Warren sign and make it look like she had the kind of support that she was hoping for. That's an example of manipulation from the left. Happens on the right too. Here, the picture on the left was circulated by a US representative on the Republican side of the aisle from the state of Arizona. He was saying how glad he was that Obama was no longer commander-in-chief now that we had to deal with Iran. Of course, that isn't a picture of Obama with a member of the Iranian government. It's a morphed picture that was taken years earlier with the Indian prime minister. And lastly, I'm not going to play this for you now, but I want to leave it to your own research if you're interested. Google Obama or go to YouTube and look at the Obama Peel deepfake. Nowadays, we can create videos that are approaching realistic quality of people saying and doing anything you'd like them to do. So if you just note it or open up a different window and put in, Obama, Jordan Peele deepfake, you'll see this video, and it's really astounding. Okay, so point number 3. Markets aren't just about constraints, whether that's natural constraints in the form of technology or artificial constraints in the form of government regulations about what we can and can't do. Within those constraints are the market actors. Those are the buyers and the sellers. And it turns out that when it comes to fake news, both the buyers and the sellers are also part of the problem. It's not just a problem about constraints. So let's look at the supply side of the informational market, the incentives of the people who are producing the news. Those people have a profit. That's their goal. Their goal is to ultimately make a profit. Doesn't matter whether they're at Fox News or the New York Times or the Associated Press or Reuters or MSNBC. Everyone is in business to make a profit. And profit in the information marketplace is a function of attention, whether that's readers or viewers or clickers, if you will. So how do you get attention? How do you build an audience? How do you get readers? How do you get watchers? It turns out that there's many different strategies for doing this, not all of which neatly align with the truth. And as long as that's true, then we should expect a kind of informational marketplace to deliver a certain amount of fake news. So let's just zoom in on the political aspect of the information market. So we could talk about fake news as it relates to alternative health or to religion or whatever, but since so much of fake news has to do with politics, let's just look at a political schema for the incentives of purveyors. So this axis is a way that we could rate news. On the vertical axis, news that was perfectly true would be at the top. News that's perfectly false would be at the bottom. On the left-right axis, news that's tilted towards a kind of liberal worldview would be on one side. News that's tilted to try to make the conservative worldview look better would be on the other side. And that gives us 4 quadrants, A, B, C, and D. Just looking at this, knowing that you want to make a profit, because that's what all news companies, all bloggers are in the business to do, where do you think the money would be? A, B, C, D? Where's the money if you had to start a media company? Turns out the money's to be made all across this graph, but only in a particular shade. In this, I call this the pyramid of strategies. If you have a business model anywhere in this blue pyramid, you're going to make money in the news marketplace. If you're outside of that blue pyramid, you're not. So what this means is, if you're a purveyor of news, you have to make sure that what you're selling falls somewhere in that pyramid shape, and you'll make a profit. If you fall outside of that, you won't. And then notice, there's a lot of money to be made by biased reporting on the left and biased reporting on the right, and untruthful reporting that's lower down on that pyramid. Now, I'm not an empirical scientist, so I can't measure these kinds of things, but there's a lot of interesting empirical evidence that confirms exactly this sort of sketch. Here's just one. It's not mine. It's from a researcher who runs a company called Ad Fontes Media in Denver, Colorado. You can go online to Ad Fontes. The name is right there in the top left corner of the screen, and check out an interactive version of this chart and look into the methodology and that sort of thing. I encourage you to do so. It's really, really interesting. But notice what we see here is we see that the market for news selling has a lot of different strategies that are effective at turning a profit. So I just want to flag a couple of these strategies so that it's clear how they're working. Look at the very top of the pyramid, Associated Press, Reuters. Being at the top of the pyramid means they rank quite high in terms of accuracy. Being in the middle of the pyramid means that they're doing fairly non-biased work. So they're not tilted to the left, they're not tilted to the right. Their reporting is fairly unbiased. That makes total sense because places like AP and Reuters are news wholesalers. They have to sell their stories to outlets down either side of this pyramid. And given that, they have strong financial incentives to make sure that their stories are accurate, or else no one would buy them, and unbiased, in which case, if it were biased, only one side of the pyramid would buy them. Look a little bit deeper down in the pyramid, you see places like CBS, some of the kind of mainstream TV stations. Again, their incentives for being in that position make total sense. They're distributed across the country. They're reaching a very politically diverse audience, so they can't afford to be too politically to the left or too politically to the right, and so forth. Fox News, way down on the right, MSNBC, way down on the left. Their incentives are to connect with a particular subset of the news reading population, and there's money to be made by, I guess, playing a little more loose with the facts, as long as you're connecting with that particular audience on those particular political issues that animate them. One more quick thing. The Weekly Standard used to be on here, and it's now gone. And that's because the Weekly Standard went out of business because it was not far enough to the right to capture a kind of a large enough readership during the Trump presidency. It's a really interesting case in how these purveyors of news are responding to real pressures in the marketplace. Okay, let me say something about the last bit then. Point number 4 about how the market works. Markets don't just have suppliers, markets have buyers. So I want to say something about the demand side of the information market. It turns out that all of us in this Zoom presentation, unfortunately, are part of the problem. There are cases where we lack incentives to believe the truth, and there are cases where we have incentives to believe what's false. Both of those contribute to the kind of fake news epidemic that we see right now, because in each of these cases, we're going to be part of the problem, and we're going to reward the news purveyors who give us what we want. So let me say something about each of these two bullet points, and then I'll be done. First, we often lack truth incentives. In other words, there's a lot of cases where nothing bad will happen to us if we don't get to the truth, if we believe what's false. So think about it this way. Incentives to believe truly require a kind of material cost of error. There has to be something bad that would happen if we got it wrong. I've been researching cars because I have a son who just turned 16. So I'm trying to figure out what kind of car for him to buy. So in this case, there's a huge material cost of error. I'm the one who decides what kind of car he's going to drive, and I want it to be something that's safe and reliable. And if I get that wrong, it's going to cost me money, or it's going to put my son's life at risk, or whatever. There's a significant cost of error. You can bet that my beliefs about used cars, are going to track the truth pretty closely. But for much of the news, there is no material cost with getting things wrong. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Once you've paid the fee at an all-you-can-eat buffet, there's no cost to going back for seconds, even if you're not likely going to finish it all. And that explains why so much food is wasted at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Well, the news, in particular political news, is often like an all-you-can-eat buffet. When we get it wrong, there's no cost to us for getting it wrong. Suppose I believe that Trump's inaugural crowd is just as large as Obama's. Okay, that's false by all the evidence that we have available, but it doesn't cost me anything to believe falsely on that particular case. I'll sleep just as well, having a false belief about the size of Trump's inaugural crowd as I would with a true belief. And given that so much of what goes around in the kind of fake news circles is such that we have no material reason to get it right, we shouldn't be surprised that people consume that information recklessly. And then second, not only do we lack incentives to get it right, we often have incentives to believe falsely. We have incentives to fit in, and we have incentives to protect our identity. So just think of the first one. Many of us on this presentation work in higher ed, so you know full well the kind of incentives you have to fit in with your colleagues, or at least not stand out if you happen to be conservative. I don't actually know anyone on my campus who voted for Trump, but I think even if there were someone who did, I wouldn't know about them because they have powerful incentives not to wear their Make America Great Again hat to campus. So they have powerful incentives to fit in. The same goes for many of the claims that are made in fake news. We have no reason to get them right, but we might have reason to just sort of accept what some certain segment of the news market is delivering to us just because we want to fit in with everyone around us. And second, we often have powerful incentives to protect and to signal our identity. I mean, the topics in fake news really are often about one's identity or your tribe. And if that's true, then those of us consuming the news have mixed motives. Yes, on the one hand, we care about the truth, but we also really care about our side. We want our side to win. And we have these motives where we really like seeing the other side get their due. And it's entertaining to watch people from our side beat up on people from the other side. And we want to consume news so that we can signal to other people that we're one of this kind of person rather than this kind of person. And anytime we have these kind of mixed motives, what it means is we have some perverse incentives. Our incentives aren't perfectly aligned with getting the truth. We have all these other kind of things tied up with it. And the result then is a fake news epidemic. Okay, so that's it. The rest of the story, I think, is more complicated, but what I hope to have done is just sort of sketched a broad overview of the first part of this book that I worked on, The Misinformation Market. I haven't told you anything about why it is we fall for misinformation or how we can do better. My goal was just to try to give you a kind of economic framework to understand why things have gotten so bad. At this point, what I'd like to do is just stop sharing my screen and have a discussion with all of you about fake news and whether you think this kind of economic lens, if you will, is a helpful way of understanding the fake news epidemic.